I come at this paper and at this data set more from the household side of things, right? So I'm especially familiar with the T1s and TIF, and this was a really nice opportunity to learn about corporate tax returns and all of the information that we get on that side of things. But I'm not as proficient in the business data as I am in the employee side data, so I'll try and answer questions as best as I can. But I definitely come at this from the household level side of things. Thanks for having me. So the work that I'm presenting today, so I'm going to start by talking about the data that we use, which is the Canadian Employee Dynamics Database, or SEED. And I'm going to talk more specifically about some work that we did with this data set on the gender pay gap in Canada. So this is joint work with Jiang Bear-Lee at StatsCan and Benoit Dosti, who's at HEC Montréal. So I'll provide just a brief overview of what SEED is, how it's structured, what it looks like, and then I'll talk a little bit about why SEED is an interesting data set to use to understand the gender pay gap, and then I'll go into specifically the work that we did looking at the role of firms in the gender pay gap in Canada. And I'll touch briefly at the end on opportunities for research. So SEED is a data set that has been used quite extensively, especially when you take in consideration that it's a relatively young data set. But I think, at least from the, in terms of what we've done with it, looking at how it interacts with gender, I think we've really just scratched the surface, and there's a lot of interesting stuff that can be done with this data set. So just to give you an idea, so SEED is a set of linkable files. It has information on both employers and employees, hence the name. So I'll get into detail a little bit more of all the variables that are included, but there really is a lot of information. And what's especially key is that it has a longitudinal structure. So if you've worked with tax data for individuals before, you're used to the fact that we can link individuals over time, right? So longitudinally, we do this through the social insurance number. It has some challenges, but it's relatively straightforward. What's really impressive and really valuable for research is that the SEED also has a longitudinal employer identifier, right, which is the business number. And the reason why it's so impressive and so valuable is that it's not as straightforward to follow companies as it is to follow individuals, right? So companies are going to come in and out of the markets. They're going to merge. They're going to acquire other companies. They're going to be absorbed by other companies. And so following firms in a way that you can meaningfully talk about these life events of the firm is quite a feat. And so the fact that they've done this for us is really, truly amazing. I'm super happy this was not my job, but I'm also really happy it's been done. So to give you a sense of what SEED is, and I'll tell you in a second why it's important, but bear with me as I show you all the acronyms. So we're going to essentially, right, so SEED is a linked employer-employee. So we have employers on one side, we have employees on the other side. The thing that's going to link them, right, is a job. And so from like an on-paper perspective, it's going to be the T4, right? So the payment slip that's issued from the employer to the employee is going to be the key to that linked data set. So on the T4, we're going to have both the business number, which is the identifier for the employer, and then the SIN number, which is obviously the identifier for the employee. And T4s are going to have all sorts of information at the job level that is relevant both for the employees, right? So earnings, contributions to CPP or QPP, but it's also going to give us already some information on the employers, things like annual payroll, annual employment, industry. And then if you look to the left at what we have for employers, you're going to see that essentially we have things that employers fill, right? So employers fill corporate income tax returns that have all sorts of information on their assets, their revenues, their liabilities. They also file, depending on whether they're incorporated or unincorporated businesses, they also file Schedule 50, so if they're incorporated, or a T1 financial declaration if they're an unincorporated business, right? So we're going to have, these things are going to give us essentially information on ownership. So you'll see in the literature that uses SEED, there's lots of things on performance of immigrant businesses, performance of businesses owned by women. So there's lots of information there already that we can go get. And employers also file information related to trade, so you'll have information on import and exports. So same principle on the employee side. The information that we have is going to depend on what individuals file, right? So we all know individuals file personal income tax returns, so we're going to have information on their employment and various sources of income. We also have, so this is also a nice feature, the SEED has been linked to the IMDb, right? So the longitudinal immigration database. So we have landing year, country of birth, knowledge of official languages. And one step further, so right, as if that wasn't enough, one step further, we have information on the families of all tax filers, right? So through the TIF, which is the T1 family files, that essentially form families, right? So the TIF is, StatsCan has taken individual T1s, it's identified families, and it's grouped that data so that we can identify different individuals within a family through a family identification number. And that also has some information at the family level. So you'll have things like total family income, the number and the age of children. So really, really rich data. And the reason I show this picture, for one thing, is just to show you how insane it is that we have access to this for research. And the second reason is also to highlight that, as is the case for all admin data sets, the source of the data is going to matter for the kinds of questions that you can ask and the kind of universe for which you're going to have coverage, right? So for instance, so if you look at business ownership, right, like you're going to have a difference between incorporated and unincorporated business. And because publicly owned corporations file neither of these things, you're not going to have, when we talk about the business ownership module, you're not going to have that information for a subset of corporations that are publicly owned or publicly traded. Right, so it's always important to remember those small things when you think about the research question you want to address and the kinds of variables you might be interested in having, because it's admin data, it's going to determine even if there's many variables, some variables are only going to be available for a subset of firms or a subset of individuals. So just to give you kind of a taster, this is a very non-exhaustive list of variables that are on SEED. So as I said, there's individual level data, so all sorts of income sources are going to be documented: employment income, self-employment income, pension and capital income, a few demographics like age and sex. We also have marital status, which is not always a given. So lots of countries don't necessarily have that in their version of SEED. So in the work that I present today, actually, we take advantage of this feature of the Canadian data set that has marital status. And of course, there's going to be immigrant status and related variables. So as I mentioned, landing year, country of birth, education for immigrants as well is going to be in there. On the family side of things, right, so we have this family identifier, which is key to identify spouses, but also parents and children. And then we have quite a bit of information on children. So we have their actual age and we have the number in each age category, right? So we have a good idea of family composition. And this comes from the personal income tax side of things. And then on the firm level side of things, lots of data there too, right? So industry, revenues and expenses, assets and liabilities, employment and payroll, workforce characteristics, right? So things like what percentage of your workforce is women. So lots of information, import, export, and as I mentioned, business ownership for all privately owned incorporated businesses and unincorporated businesses, right? So even businesses that are going to appear through T1s are going to be in there, so you're going to know who owns them. And then there's some geography information. So there's province, but there's also sub-provincial level geography information. For the most part, the data is available starting in 2001, right? So we have a little under 20 years of data because it takes some time to process and min data. So for the 2018 vintage, for instance, I think it runs up to 2016. There are some exceptions. So the IMDb information, for instance, is available for all non-permanent residents that are admitted in 80 or later. So quite a bit more information. But then the export and export data, for instance, only starts in 2010. And I think the business ownership data as well starts like in the mid-2000s or something. But generally, it starts in 2001, so we're going to use, for instance, in the paper, 2001, 2015, I think, because we used the 2017 vintage. And the population of the seed is going to be not quite everyone, but pretty close. So we have all individual tax filers and their families. So obviously employees who receive T4 slips, all incorporated and unincorporated businesses, so all of them. And then for a large subset of those businesses, we're going to have information on the business owners themselves. So this is for seed. So just a quick overview of what it is, right? It's a lot of things, as you can see. And so it's been used extensively in research to address all sorts of questions, some of them more oriented towards the business side of things. And so in the paper that I'm presenting today, we use it to look at the gender pay gap. And so you might ask, why do we want to use that kind of data set to look at the gender pay gap? And the first reason is that there's increasing recognition that firms play an important role in the gender pay gap. Right, so we know that there's been quite a bit of convergence in the economic outcomes of men and women, but there also has been a slowdown in that convergence. At the same time, the factors that are associated with the gender pay gap have changed over time. So there was a time when differences in productivity characteristics like education or experience accounted for a large part of the gap. It's not so true today, right? So women have made lots of gains in terms of human capital relative to men. And so the things that account for the gap nowadays are more in the order of industries and occupations and firms. And so there's a large and growing body of research that has looked at the role of firms in all over the world in the gender pay gap. And generally, it's been you could divide it in two strands of literature. So there's research that has looked at the way women and men source differently into higher paying firms. So in the paper, we're going to link that to something we can measure, and we're going to call that the sorting effect. And then within a given firm, you can have differences in women's both ability and willingness to access better paid positions. And so, broadly speaking, it's going to be called, we're going to follow literature and call it the bargaining effect, even though there's obviously a lot of stuff that underlies this ability or willingness to access better paid positions. We're not so much going to talk about mechanisms or even whether or not it's good or bad, but generally you're going to have essentially those two strands of literature, and then research that tries to bridge that and compare the importance of the two channels. But of course, if you want to look at the role of firms, you need something that documents some dimension of the firms that people are working for. So there's many options, all of which have been used to different extents in the literature, and this list is by no means exhaustive. It's just to give you an idea of the kinds of things that are available out there, and in that context, why SEED is an interesting resource to have to further that question. So something that's been done quite extensively, right, is to use survey of individuals or employees. So the labor force survey, for instance, has been used to look at the gender pay gap. You could use things like LISA, that also has information. So these surveys generally have information on employment, occupation, industry, right? These are pretty common variables. Some of them will also have information on the job training, the kinds of skills used at work, right? So you can get at the role of firms a little bit indirectly by looking at the workplace characteristics of the workers for whom we have lots of information. So the strength of these surveys is usually they're pretty widely available. You do have a lot of characteristics about workers, so that can be useful. But firms are really documented indirectly through what we know about the workers. and their work. And then there's also some survey of employers and to some extent of their employees, right, that collect information on workplace practices. So in Canada, one example, for instance, would be the Workplace and Employee Survey that was unfortunately discontinued in 2006. So it'll inform things like, so these surveys tend to have a lot of information on HR practices, workplace performance, technology use, right? So a lot of information, a lot of detailed information on workplaces, and the kind of information that really you can only have through surveys. And so their strength is really going to be the type of information that they're collecting that allows you to really talk about the mechanisms through which firms influence people's outcomes. And you know, the counter here obviously is that they typically only document some worker characteristics. And then finally, of course, I'm going to talk about the employer-employee linked administrative data. So SEED is one example of those. In Canada, we also have the, I think it's called the longitudinal worker file, that also has some linked data between employers and employees. So I've never worked with it, but my understanding is that it has nowhere near the range of variables that's included in SEED, but also a really useful resource. And the advantages, right? The advantages of admin data are always the same, and they're huge. They come at a cost, but they're huge. So for one thing, you have a really large sample. So in this case, we have essentially everyone. So real large sample size, which is nice because then you don't have to count your stars, but it's also nice because it means that you can look at very specific questions, right? So if you want to ask, what are the determinants of firm performance in firms that are owned by women of, you know, Southeastern Asian origin? You could ask that question with SEED, but you can't do that with survey data. So the large sample size buys you a lot of latitude in how narrowly you can define your question. Same thing if you want to look at, you know, the firm performance in a very narrowly defined geographical area, the kind of stuff you can do if you have this type of sample size. And of course, I mean, I've given you a kind of a taster. You have many variables, and in some cases, very detailed variables, right? So SEED will give you the almost entire breakdown of income sources for employees. It gives you also very detailed information on the revenues and expenses of firms. And what's nice is that because it's in Min data, you don't have to be worried about respondent fatigue. You don't have to be worried about recall, right? So the quality of the data is usually really high for what it measures. Another nice feature is because it's in Min data, you don't have to be so worried about non-response issues, especially attrition. And you can be fairly confident that the data is going to be available for long periods of time, because once you have the data cleaning process in place, maintaining it is much less costly from a government perspective than maintaining a longitudinal survey, for instance. So lots of good reasons to use SEED to look at the role of firms, among other things, with respect to the gender pay gap. But of course, the number one limitation with admin data in Canada is that I don't know if the number one in my opinion and the things that I've done, I'm sure other people might tell you something different, but a big challenge, and the challenge that I am going to talk about today, is that you don't have hours and wages documented separately in Canadian admin records, and there's just no way of getting around that. And so that means that you're always working down to earnings, and this is going to have some challenges for us. So I'll show you how we address them, and I'm a bit of a glass half full kind of person with respect to data. So I think, you know, the huge benefits that we get from something like SEED are worth the hoop jumping that we have to do a little bit to work with earnings data, but I'm really happy to talk about it more if you have different opinions. And then, you know, of course, the same thing kind of holds for employers. So like, you know, we are going to talk about something like pay setting practices in the paper that I'm presenting today, but we don't actually observe pay setting practices, right? We're going to interpret some difference in something as a difference in pay setting practice, but we don't observe HR practices the way you would, for instance, with the workplace and employee survey. So having said all this, actually, so maybe this is a good point to stop and ask if anyone has a question about kind of just the overview of SEED and you know what it can buy us for studying the gender pay gap in general. All right, then I'll continue. So as I mentioned, the paper that I'm presenting today is joint work with Zhang Beryl Lee and Benoit Desti. So we asked a question, what is the role of firm-specific pay policies on the gender earnings gap in Canada? So the paper is based on an approach that was developed by Cardoso and Kline. I'm going to call them CCK from now on. So it's really quite simple. So we start from a simple wage equation with worker and firm fixed effects. And then we're going to estimate the models separately for men and women. And we're going to use an OACA style decomposition to interpret the differences in the firm premiums of men and women. All right, so we're going to refer to the fact that women and men can be unequally distributed across firms with different premiums, right? So the premiums can differ for different reasons. One of those reasons is that women and men work at different firms, and so they're going to have access to different firm premiums. We're going to refer to that difference as the sorting effect. And then the fact that within a given firm, women and men can capture different shares of firm surplus. So for a same firm, you can have different firm premiums by sex. We're going to call this the bargaining effect. So when I say we're going to call this is really just following CCK. But you can see that even just with this simple decomposition that we riff a little bit on, you can get a bit of interesting insight into the role that firms play in the gender pay gap in Canada. Just to give you an overview of the results. So we find that firm premiums, so differences across men and women in firm premiums account for nearly 1/4 of the earnings gap. The differential sorting of women and men in high-paying firms accounts for approximately half of that contribution, and the rest is going to come through that bargaining effect, where the fact that within the same firm, there's pay disparities between sexes. And I should say that the bargaining effect that we measure in Canada is quite a bit larger in relative terms than what's been seen in other countries. And I'll talk a little bit of why that might be the case, because it's part of what might be interesting and what we find. And then we explore some variation over the life cycle by parental and marital status and across provinces. So to give you a bit of background on this methodology, so it has been so a lot of authors have used employer and employee linked data in slightly different ways to get at the role of firms. So one such approach is CCK 2016. So they use data from Portugal from 2000 to 2009 to focus on private sector employees, as we will do. And then they find that the firm premium accounts for about 1/5 of the gender wage gap, right? So we find about 1/4, so it's roughly in the same territory. And then they find that the sorting effect accounts for 70% roughly of the firm contribution, and the remaining 30% comes through the bargaining channel. So the same approach has been used in other countries. There is quite a bit of range on the total firm contribution to the gender gap. Right, so we have something as low as 8 or 11% in France and 1990s West Germany, and as high as 50 to 60% in some South American countries. So quite a bit of range. We fall somewhere in the middle, right? So we're at I think 23%. However, in different countries, the role of sorting has generally been found to be important. And around 70-75% of the total firm contribution. So as I mentioned, we find a relatively larger role for bargaining. So the starting point is this additive two-way worker firm effects model, right? So it's just the same kind of model that was considered by AKM. So we control for some time variant observed characteristics of workers or firm or jobs. So in our case, we're going to control for age, province, marital status, presence of children. We have a worker fixed effect, firm fixed effect, right? So firm J is the firm at which worker I works at time T. And then we have a residual error that's going to capture a number of things. So generally, it's going to capture time-varying firm-wide shocks to surplus, right? So shocks that affect the surplus for all workers, but that change over time. We're going to have firm worker match effects, and then transitory wage shocks. So there's a number of empirical considerations or things to take into consideration when you want to estimate this model and get something that you can use, essentially. So for the model to produce unbiased estimates of the firm fixed effect, we know that we need an exogenous mobility assumption to hold, right? So essentially, if I just go back one slide, what it means is that these factors that come in through the error term, they can't be correlated with worker mobility, right? So worker mobility is what's going to identify the firm fixed effects. So we can't have that mobility correlated with the error term, essentially. And I'll get to how we look at those different empirical considerations into data shortly, but just to lay it all there. So you have the exogenous mobility assumption. It's well-established assumption. It goes back to the original IKM paper in '99. It's been debated. Many people have looked at it. There's not much new there, but it is there. And then another thing to have in mind is that worker and firm fixed effects are only identified in what we're going to call a connected set, right? So essentially a set of firms that are connected by worker mobility. So we need, what that means in practice is that we're going to get rid of firms that have only one worker or so, or yeah. And then for each equation, the firm effects are only identified relative to a reference set of firms. So again, I'll get to what that means in practice shortly after I tell you a little bit more about the sample restrictions we impose on the data. But it's essentially the reason why, or part of the reason why seed is so appealing, right? So we not only observe which firm the workers are working at, but we have lots of information on the firms, and we're going to use that to define a reference set of firms, right? So that we can compare the firm premiums for women and for men. So I mentioned that we're going to estimate the two wage equations separately for men and women, get the firm premiums and compare those. Making that comparison cannot be done on the raw estimated firm effects. They have to be normalized, and we're going to need some of the information that we have on firms to do that normalization. And to do that, we're going to need to restrict the data set a little further. So we're going to use what we call the dual connected set, right? So it's the firms that are in the connected set that have both men and women that work at them. So we're also going to get rid of firms where only men or only women work. So the total contribution to the gender earnings gap, right? So the gender earnings gap is just going to be the difference in earnings. The total contribution of firms to that gender earnings gap is going to be the difference in the premiums that are paid to men and the premiums that are paid to women, right? So that's what the firm contributes to the gender gap. Here the psi m identifies or denotes firm effects for men, psi w denotes firm effects for women. And this can be decomposed very much like what we do, for a typical Walker decomposition into the bargaining and the sorting effect, right? So the bargaining effect is going to be this here. And so you can see it's going to capture the degree to which women obtain a smaller share of surplus generated by firms than men, right? So in practice, we're going to calculate this by comparing the men and the women firm effects across the distribution of jobs that are held by men. And then the sorting effect is kind of the counter of that, right? So it's going to capture the degree to which women and men are segregated in different firms, so firms that pay different premiums. And we're going to calculate that by comparing the average value of the premium across the jobs that are held by men and women. So again, just to reiterate a little bit, we're going to have a total firm contribution that is going to be a portion of our total earnings gap. And we're going to decompose that into an effect that takes that represents how men and women sort into different firms, right? So when I say different firms, I mean in terms of firm premiums, and then conditional on which firm they're in, whether or not they access or they're able to share in the surplus. So before I show you some numbers or some results, so the version of seed that we worked with is the 2001-2015. We're going to focus on workers that are 25 to 54 and that work at incorporated businesses in the business sector. So the reason for the focus on incorporated businesses, right, is that the idea is we're interested in firm practices, so we're interested in employers essentially. So we're going to throw away all people who are self-employed because presumably all the dynamics that are going on there are very different from what's happening at an incorporated firm that hires employees. We're also going to focus on the business sector, so we're going to exclude people that work in the public sector and private businesses that work in education, health, or public administration. And the reason is because those firms are defined a bit differently. So the public sector is defined a bit differently. And so in the data, you tend to have really, really large firms in a way that is not necessarily comparable with a private business that is really large. And so we throw away that with the caveat, obviously, that at least education and health and public admin to some extent are sectors where you do find a lot of women employed. So when we discuss results, you have to keep in mind that we're really talking about private businesses in the non-education health sector. So just to have in mind to understand the scope of our results. So we're going to focus on earnings, as I mentioned, right? So we don't have wages and hours, unfortunately, which is going to be a challenge that we have to contend with. So part of the problem is that obviously differences in earnings are going to reflect both differences in wages and in hours, and we'd like to minimize the effect of the differences in hours as much as we can, given that we don't know how many hours people work. So what we're going to try and do is we're going to apply an earnings threshold of roughly $18,000 that is equal to full-time, full-year employment and minimum wage. And so we're going to try and get rid as much as possible of people that work only part-time. So this is a very imperfect way to go about this, but I'll try and convince you that it doesn't affect the nature of our results. And then from the employer side, we're going to need to have, as I mentioned, we're going to need to have a measure of surplus. So we're going to use real value added per worker. So the number of workers comes from the payroll deduction and remittance file, so the PD7. Real value added is going to be measured as the sum of T4 payrolls and net income before taxes and extraordinary items. And we're going to get rid of a few businesses. So businesses that only have one employee throughout the sample period, we're going to have to throw away. We also get rid of very, very small businesses. So, things that have value added below $100. Are there any questions before I go into the results section? All right. So first, let me show you a little bit the kind of sample that we're working with. So ultimately, we're going to estimate the two wage equations on the connected set, which is documented in these columns. But we're going to use the dual connected set to normalize the firm fixed effects. And so when we talk about the role, the total firm contribution and the role of sorting and bargaining, we're going to be using the dual connected set. But if you go to the left, just to start, so columns 1 and 2, you can see, right, so as you might expect, obviously, that on average, males earn more than females. Men also tend to work at smaller firms than women, which is something that's generally observed in many, many places. And they also work at firms. So men tend to work at firms where there are more men. So these are features that are reproduced in the US and the UK. In Portugal, it's the same thing. So these are pretty standard features. And then we can see that once you restrict the data set to only those, the firms in the connected set, right? So we have small increases in earnings, but nothing major. We have a change in the size of firms, right? So not surprisingly, the size of the average firm. So when I talk about the size of the firm, it's in terms of number of employees. So the size of the firms go up a little bit when we get rid of businesses that only have one employee. So that's, mechanical almost. Same thing, so as you move towards a dual connected set, earnings go up a little bit, but the earnings gap doesn't change much. Median firm size also goes up. And we still have that result that men work at in male-dominated firms, essentially. And you can see here the large quantity of observations that we have. So we're not concerned about sample size, obviously. Okay, so I told you that for the AKM model to give us unbiased estimates of firm effects, we need to have exogenous mobility, right? So we can't have that worker mobility is correlated with time-varying shocks to wages. So either in the form of firm-wide shocks to surplus, or worker-firm match effects, or just transitory components of wage. There's quite a bit of evidence in the literature that has looked at the role of firms with respect to wage inequality. That we can reasonably expect this assumption to hold in many contexts. In seed, one of the important challenges that we face is because of the fact that we use earnings data and we use a threshold essentially to get rid as much as possible of part-time employees, in transition years, earnings are mechanically going to be different because we only keep earnings from one job, right? So we don't aggregate all of the T4s for a person in a year. We'll just keep the highest paying job. And so when someone changes job, mechanically the earnings are going to drop in the year that they leave, which looks like a violation of exogenous mobility, but is really just hard to assess given the data that we have. So what's been done instead in another paper by Benoit and Beryl with Card and Parent, is that they've looked at the earnings gains of people who move up the job ladder and compare those to losses of people who move down, right? So the exogenous mobility assumption implies that these things should be fairly symmetrical, and it is what they find using seed. So there's some evidence that we can trust that the exogenous mobility assumption holds in our data, but as I mentioned, again, we're always going to have to come back to this limitation, and this is one of the places where kind of the rubber hits the road, which is that we can't really look at exogenous mobility the way that other researchers have, because mechanically we see a violation that isn't. It could be one or it could not be one. So it's hard to assess the traditional way. So we have to rely on an alternative, and that's generally what we're going to do. Is we're going to find ways to get around those earnings hurdles. And as I mentioned, we also have to normalize the estimated firm effects, right? So so when we estimate separately the wage equations for men and women, we get sets of firm effects that are essentially that have meaning only relative to a reference set of firms. So what we need is to normalize that set of firms so that we can compare the firm fixed effects across men and women. So what we're going to do is we're going to assume that low surplus firms don't share rents with workers. And so for those firms, the firm premiums should be 0. So what we need to do is we need to define what a low surplus firm is. And to do that, we're going to use our measure of value added that I mentioned earlier, which is in the seed, which is one of the reasons why seed is nice for this. And so we're going to estimate very simple equations, right? So you have on the left side the non-normalized estimated firm effects. And then we're going to assume that past a certain threshold, firms start sharing rents. Right, past a certain threshold of surplus, firms start sharing rents. So below that threshold, we're going to essentially set all the firm effects to 0, and then we're going to normalize the rest accordingly. So just to give you a kind of a visual of what that means, right? You can plot, for instance, the firm premium, so that's what you have in the vertical axis, against the real value added measures. We've binned real value added in 100 bins, and we've calculated the average firm effects in each bin. And if you plot that, you see that you have essentially a flat portion and then an inflection point after which you have an upswing in firm effects, right? So what we're trying to do is essentially identify this inflection point and use that to normalize the firm effects. And it's those normalized firm effects that we're going to use after to talk about the contribution of firm premiums to the gender pay gap. All right, so now that I've said all this, I'll just have a drink of water and then go into the results, which is really the most interesting part. All right, so I'm going to show you a number of tables where we have, so in each table, you'll have the firm contribution and the role of sorting and bargaining for all groups. And then we've also done it, so we've done the exercise of constructing the bargaining and the sorting effect for different subgroups. So we've done it by age group, by presence of children, which are generally found in literature. One of the contributions of the paper is that we can do it by marital status. So what I show you today about marital status is, to the best of my knowledge, new and quite interesting. I hope you'll find it interesting. I find it interesting. And then we've done it also for the three largest provinces, and we've done some of those by province, and so we've done by province and present children, and by province and marital status. But before we start with the subgroups, right? So you have here, so column 1, right, is the gender earnings gap. So you can see it's roughly 27%. And then we have the mean firm premium for men. Right, so if you remember that slide that I showed you where we had the firm contribution equals the average firm premium for men minus the average firm premium for women, right, you have those two values here. And then that difference, which is the total firm contribution to the gap, is here, right? So this is the first thing that we're interested in. And it's about 6%. So you can see that the total firm contribution accounts for roughly a quarter of the gender earnings gap. And then if you look at the different, if we do that decomposition that I showed you, you can see that the sorting effect accounts for nearly half of that contribution, so 0.03 out of 0.06, and then the bargaining effect accounts for the other half. And as I mentioned, this is a large estimate for the bargaining effect, and unfortunately we can't exclude the possibility that some of that comes from the fact that we're using earnings. But we have some evidence that it's not the only thing that's driving it. If it is driving some of it, it's not the only thing that's driving it. One of those pieces of evidence is that we're not the only paper that's used earnings, and other papers that have done it have generally found the importance of bargaining to be in line with what shows up in other countries that use wage. And so if our use of earnings is driving some of that, it's most likely not driving all of it. So at least some of that is actually that we have a large bargaining effect in Canada. And the other piece of evidence that we have is that some researchers have looked at the difference in sorting and bargaining between hours and wages, and they find that it's roughly similar across the two, right? So it's not just that bargaining is especially large in hours, and so like this is what's driving the effect here. It seems like we just have a large bargaining effect in Canada. Now, if you look at this by age group, right, so we've broken it down by 25 to 29, 30 to 39, 40 to 49, and 50 to 54. And you can see that, so first of all, the gender earnings gap increases, right, if you look at column 1, increases by age group. This is fairly standard. But what's perhaps even more interesting is that the contribution of firms, is particularly large for the younger age group. And bargaining is particularly large for the younger age group, right? So what we see is that sorting is going to increase over the life cycle. And this is in line with what's been found elsewhere. So again, one more piece of evidence in telling us that our use of earnings still yields, results that we can trust. Right, so sorting goes from explaining 33% of firms' contribution to the gap to over half for the older age groups. So unsurprisingly, when we do this by the presence of children, we find consistent results with the age differences, right? So the age and presence of children are obviously intertwined. And so, we find that the gap is wider among people with children. The role of firms is similar, but the effect of sorting is quite a bit larger among people that have children than among people that don't have children. So again, this is in line with the literature, and some of the authors that have dug a little bit into that have found that women. I mean, this is not news, but women are, at least women with children, tend to work at workplaces that are closer to their home. They have more flexible hours, and so that's necessarily going to show up in our sorting effect here. Well, not necessarily, but it shows up. Okay, so the next piece is marital status, which, as I've told you, is new to our paper. So the first bit is to notice is that the gender earnings gap changes quite a bit with marital status, right? So you can see that it's about 34% for married women compared to barely 11% among singles. So a large difference, and even among married in common law, you have quite a bit of a difference, right? So the common law people that are in common law unions have a gap that is roughly 2/3 of what you see among married people. And that's not necessarily surprising, because we know that married men have higher wages than non-married men, and then married women have lower wages than non-married women. So obviously the gap is larger if you focus on married individuals. What is new, however, is how the role of firms changes across people with different marital status, right? So you can see here that that gap is accounted for, so 42% of that gap is accounted for among singles by firms, so by differences in firm premiums, compared to only 20% among married individuals, right? So twice as much of the gap, of the smaller gap, admittedly, but twice as much of the gap is accounted for by firms among single individuals. There are important differences in the importance of sorting in accounting for the role of the firms. So sorting is much more important among married individuals, even more so than among common law individuals. So there again, we have an important difference between individuals that are in legally different partnerships. Still the difference is largest when you compare it to singles. Which means also that singles are the group where bargaining is the most important. Finally, so I haven't mentioned this yet, but one of the things that this part of the literature, right, is going to compare the different channels, but doesn't yet say that much about what drives the importance of those different channels. And to the extent that we have bits and pieces of insight into that, it's come in large part from comparisons across groups like by age, like I've just shown you, like by age, like presence of children, marital status, or by cross-country comparisons or informal cross-country comparisons that use discussion of the institutional context to try and gain insight into the relative importance of the different channels. So I've told you that bargaining is particularly important in Canada compared to what we find in other countries. One of the things that we were interested in when we started doing this work is to see whether that difference is true across Canada, or whether it's driven by certain regions of Canada more than others. So if you look at Quebec, Ontario, and BC, which make up about 3/4 of the labor force in Canada, so you can see that, and this is not new, the gap is largest in BC, smallest in Quebec. But what's particularly interesting is that the importance of the bargaining channel is, I'll stop clicking, is largely driven by what's happening in Quebec and to a lesser extent Ontario. In comparison, the importance of bargaining in BC is much more on the scale of what we see in other countries. So this finding that we have for Canada is not uniform across Canada, even though many of the institutions, not all, but many of the institutions that we would think could impact the role of firms are going to be uniform across the country. And so we have important differences in terms of the role of those two channels, even within a country. Which is a good thing to have in mind when you think about the international comparisons. So I think I only have 5 minutes left, so I'll move on to the next slide, because it gives us another bit of an insight into what's going on, or the numbers that I've shown you. So this is essentially a similar table to what I've shown you so far. I've just gotten rid of the columns 2 and 3 because for space considerations. Right, so you have here the gender earnings gap, and skip straight to the total firm contribution, and then the sorting and the bargaining effects. And so, in the first row, you just have the numbers reproduced on the earlier table. Right, so remember that the sorting effect is largest for people with children, and we see that this is true across all provinces. But it's especially true that the greater importance of sorting among individuals with children is especially true in Quebec. Right. So again, we can start looking into those differences to think about the kinds of institutions that we might want to look at, and the kind of variation that we might want to turn to better understand what is driving those differences. And if we finally go there we go. So same thing here. So sorry, I should have separated this a little bit better, but same thing here. So we have, here the slide focuses on married, common law, and single by province. Right, so remember the general trend is that sorting is largest for married individuals and least important for single individuals. And again, so if you focus on Quebec, you can see that the importance of sorting among single individuals is particularly pronounced in Quebec compared to the other provinces. So it's true in all provinces, but it's particularly important it's particularly true in Quebec. So what this means, right, is that so remember, we start from the idea that the bargaining is particularly important in Canada, which is interesting because, which makes sense on one end because we have largely decentralized institutions for wage bargaining, but there are differences within the country. And the importance of bargaining is largely driven by Quebec and to a lesser extent Ontario. And not only that, but the importance of bargaining is largely driven by non-parents and single workers in Quebec. And this is an important result because a lot of the discussion around the relative importance of sorting and bargaining has centered around what happens over the life cycle as couples and women have children, and people select, or women select in increasingly different firms than men. But what we find is that the importance of bargaining here seems to come in large part from non-parents and single workers. And so there is more to it than just sorting and having children. So just to wrap up, a quarter of the earnings gap in Canada is accounted for by differences in firm premiums, and this is largely in line with what's found in European countries, for instance. We find a somewhat large bargaining effect And it seems to be in large part driven by what's happening in Quebec with non-parents and singles. We also find generally important differences in sorting by marital status. So sorting is really important among married workers, much less so among single workers. And there's also important differences between common and married, which point again to the fact that other family composition decisions other than having children are going to interact with the role of firms in people's economic outcomes. So just, I know I only have a few seconds left, but but I'm happy to talk more about this after the talk. My main takeaway from those results is that there's lots of material in terms of firm and family interactions that deserves our attention to understand, gender pay disparities. And we see some of that evidence when we look at, the differences by marital status. And I think that the structure of SEED is ideal to try and go look at this, because, we've done something, quite simple here, but we have information on spouses. We can follow spouses as they move from one firm to the other, as they move across the country, for instance, to follow different jobs. So we can really get into the nitty-gritty of like how firms and families interact and how that determines the outcomes of men and women differently. We also have information on business ownership and self-employment, which more and more the discussion around the gender pay gap has been, about the challenges for women to access higher paid positions, and one way in which this can be expressed is through business ownership. And so not only can we look at business ownership for women, but we can look at business ownership for different groups of women, for example, women of different origins that may have access to different, that may face different challenges, but may also have access to different kind of networks and other such things in the labor market. And finally, something that's a little bit of a fantasy, but I think would be possible, is that we can potentially use this data to look at intergenerational questions surrounding the interaction of firms and families. So there's a few cohorts for which we could both link parents and children, and observe children as they join the labor market, as they potentially take on, a similar job as their parents, or take over their parents' business. And so there's a lot of material there. Really is the conclusion here. Okay, so I'll stop here, but I'd be really happy to talk more about this after if you have some questions. Thank you.